The coin hit the wooden counter of the Dusty Creek stage depot with a sound so small, so insignificant, that the station clerk barely glanced up. But every soul crowded into that sweltering August afternoon of 1878 went utterly still. Not because of the coin itself. Not because of the thin, desperate woman standing at the counter with nothing but the clothes on her back and a bruise yellowing along her jaw. They went still because of the man who had placed it there. Phineas Rourke. The name alone was enough to drain color from a man's face west of the Mississippi. They called him the Laramie Ghost, though he had not set foot in Laramie in 3 years. They called him the Devil's Accountant, because every debt he collected was paid in full and final. He had ridden into Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, that morning with 2 Colt single-action Army revolvers on his hips and a reputation that preceded him like a dark thundercloud before a killing storm. He had not spoken a word to anyone. He had sat in the corner of the saloon, drank 1 glass of whiskey, and watched the room the way a hawk watches a field of tall grass. And now he was standing at the stage depot counter, pushing the last coin in his pocket across the worn wood toward a woman he had never met before that afternoon, paying her fare to Santa Fe. Julia Shelton stared at the coin, then she stared at the man beside her. His jaw was set like iron. His eyes, a strange weathered gray the color of winter sky, did not look at her. They were fixed on the clerk with an expression that made the clerk snatch up that coin so fast he nearly knocked over his own inkwell. "One way to Santa Fe," Phineas said. His voice was low and flat, the kind of voice that did not request, did not ask, simply stated facts the way the earth stated its own hardness. Julia found her own voice somewhere beneath the shock. "I cannot accept that. Already done. Sir, I do not even know your name." He turned then and looked at her, and something moved through his eyes that nobody in that room had ever seen before and nobody could quite name. It was not pity. Phineas Rourke did not do pity. It was something rawer than that, something that looked almost like recognition, as though he were seeing in her face some answer to a question he had been carrying alone for years. "Phineas Rourke," he said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She watched the ripple of it cross the faces of the men behind her, watched their shoulders change shape, watched the clerk's hand freeze on his receipt book. Julia Shelton lifted her chin. She had been through too much in the past 72 hours to be impressed by a dangerous reputation. She had been through too much to be grateful quietly either, because quiet gratitude was what men like her former husband had always demanded of her, and she was finished with that particular currency. "Then I thank you, Mr. Rourke," she said, steady and clear. "And I intend to repay you the moment I reach my sister in Santa Fe." He did not answer. He simply turned away. She watched him walk back out into the brutal New Mexico sun, and she noticed, though she could not explain why it mattered, that he did not look back. She would learn later, from a man named Tully who drove freight wagons between Dusty Creek and the territorial capital, that Phineas Rourke had ridden into this dried-up, forgotten speck of a town because he had been hired to kill someone. She would learn that the someone in question had already fled by the time Rourke arrived, and that in the process of figuring that out, he had spent nearly everything he carried. She would learn that the coin he pressed across that counter was genuinely, absolutely his last one, because Tully had been standing close enough at the saloon to hear the hollow sound Rourke's purse made when he stuffed it back in his vest pocket. Nobody had seen the gunslinger go soft until he handed her his last coin for stage fare, and the story of why that moment had happened, and what it cost both of them, and what it eventually made of them both, was not a short one. It had begun 3 days earlier with a dust storm and a broken wagon wheel. Julia Shelton had left her husband in the town of Redemption, Texas, on a Tuesday morning in the first week of August, 1878. Left was perhaps too clean a word. She had gathered the 3 things she refused to surrender to Gerald Shelton's wrath, which were her grandmother's silver thimble, a small envelope of seeds for the garden she had never been allowed to plant, and her own 2 feet, and she had walked out the front door while Gerald was occupied at the bank negotiating a loan he had no intention of repaying honestly. She was 26 years old. She had been married at 19 to a man her father had called a good prospect, and she had spent 7 years discovering precisely how wrong a man could be about a prospect. Gerald Shelton was not violent in the obvious ways that the law in 1878 would have recognized. He was violent in the ways the law had no language for yet. He controlled her money, her movements, her correspondence, her friendships, her voice at the table. The yellowing bruise along her jaw was the first time he had used his hand rather than his authority, and Julia had taken it as a message. Not the message he intended, which was submission, but the message underneath it, which was that she had finally reached the absolute limit of what she would endure. Her sister Marguerite lived in Santa Fe, married to a territorial judge named Wallace Hart. They had written to each other for years through letters that Gerald inspected before Julia was permitted to read them. She had learned to read between the lines of Marguerite's careful, censored words. She had written her own responses with the same careful subterranean language. They both understood without ever saying it plainly that if Julia ever needed to come, Marguerite's door would open. Julia had no money. Gerald controlled all of it. She had the clothes she was wearing, which were good wool and cotton because she had always dressed well since Gerald liked the appearance of a prosperous household, and she had the thimble, the seeds, and her feet. She had walked 6 miles out of Redemption before a farmer named Cooper, going north with a load of corn, gave her a ride as far as the New Mexico territorial line. She had thanked him sincerely. He had been a decent man who asked no questions and expected nothing in return, and she thought later that meeting him first had been a gift of perspective, because it reminded her that not all men were Gerald. From the territorial line she had caught 2 more rides, one with a minister and his wife who were relocating their congregation, and one with a group of women who ran a traveling laundry service between small towns, women who took one look at Julia and asked no questions either, only handed her a biscuit and made room on the wagon bench. She had ridden 40 miles with the laundry women before their wagon wheel split on a rocky patch of desert road 7 miles outside of Dusty Creek. She had walked those 7 miles in the August heat. She had arrived in Dusty Creek with a face full of trail dust, shoes that had developed a hole in the left sole, and a jaw that had begun to ache again from the dry air and the tension of holding herself upright through sheer willpower alone. She had inquired at the general store about the stage to Santa Fe. The woman behind the counter, a Mrs. Adeline Fitch, had told her the fare was $1.20 and that the next stage departed at 3 in the afternoon. Julia had exactly nothing. She had stood in the street outside the general store and looked at the stage depot across the road and calculated her options. She could ask for work. There was no time for that. She could ask for charity. The word tasted like ash. She had been dependent on a man's charity for 7 years, and it had cost her everything that mattered. She could write to Marguerite, but the letter would take 2 weeks minimum, and she had no money for postage either. She could wait and figure something out, but waiting in Dusty Creek meant the very real possibility that Gerald Shelton, who was not a man to accept loss of any kind, would find her. She was standing there working through the mathematics of desperation when she became aware that she was being watched. She had developed, over 7 years of living with a man who used surveillance as a weapon, a very accurate sense of when eyes were on her. She turned toward the saloon across the street, and through the batwing doors she could see, in the dim interior, a man sitting in the far corner. He was watching her with an attention that was utterly still, utterly focused, and somehow entirely devoid of threat, which was a strange combination that she noted precisely because it was so unfamiliar. She did not yet know who he was. She turned back to her problem. She had crossed to the stage depot and spoken to the clerk, whose name was Mr. Hiram Potts, and asked him directly whether any allowance was made in cases of genuine necessity. Hiram Potts had looked at her with the kind of sympathetic discomfort that men of his position in 1878 often showed women in impossible situations, a recognition of injustice paired with an absolute unwillingness to do anything about it, and told her that the Butterfield Stage Company had a fixed fare policy, and he was very sorry but there was nothing to be done. She had thanked him, turned away from the counter, and found herself face to face with a man who was placing something on the counter behind her. The coin, Phineas Rourke. She had not seen him cross the street. She had not heard him come in. She had simply turned, and there he was, 6 feet of weathered leather in quiet danger, pressing $1.20 across the counter of Hiram Potts's stage depot without any preliminary, without any announcement, without any apparent desire for acknowledgement. And when she had tried to refuse it, he had simply said, "Already done." That was the moment that Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, in August of 1878, witnessed something nobody could quite believe they were seeing. The fact of it traveled the town before the stage had even departed. By the time Julia Shelton was seated on the stage's wooden bench with her hands folded in her lap, 3 different men had sidled up to Phineas Rourke in the saloon and made oblique, careful inquiries about whether everything was all right, because they were so completely at a loss to explain what they had witnessed that they had convinced themselves something must be wrong with him. He did not explain himself to any of them. He ordered another glass of whiskey, which he did not drink, and stared at the far wall, and thought about the fact that the stage to Santa Fe departed at 3 o'clock, and it was now 2:30. The truth was, Phineas Rourke did not entirely understand what had happened either. He had watched her standing in the street because that was what he did. He watched everything. It was a survival habit as fundamental as breathing, developed over 15 years of living by contracts and consequences in the most unforgiving country on the continent. He watched her because she was a woman alone in a town that had nothing to offer her, and a woman alone in a town that had nothing to offer her was either a danger or in danger, and he had learned to categorize quickly. He had categorized her in about 30 seconds. The bruise. The posture, which was upright and controlled in the specific way of someone who had learned to control their posture, because showing weakness was genuinely dangerous. The shoes that she kept her weight off the left one slightly, which meant something was wrong with it. The fact that she had asked the storekeeper a question, received an answer she clearly did not like, and had not argued, not pleaded, not cried, only turned away and straightened up a further fraction of an inch and kept moving. That fraction of an inch had done something to him that he could not account for. He had not planned to cross the street. He had simply found himself doing it. He had not planned to spend his last coin. He had simply done that too. Phineas Rourke was 32 years old. He had grown up in Missouri, the 3rd son of a failed farmer who had eventually sold what land he had and disappeared west, leaving his wife and 4 children in the care of a county that did not want them. He had left home at 17 with a borrowed horse and an old Remington revolver that he taught himself to use on the long, empty miles between Missouri and Kansas. He had spent 2 years learning that the fastest way to eat in the West was to be better with a gun than the man next to you. He had spent the next 13 years in the particular and terrible profession of a man who hired his skill with a weapon to whoever could pay for it. He was not a murderer in the common sense. He had never killed anyone who had not drawn first or given him no choice. He had a code, which was rigid and specific and entirely his own, because the law in the territory was a patchwork thing that left enormous room for the code of the individual to operate. His code said he did not work for men who hurt women or children. His code said he did not take a contract without knowing who the target was and why. His code said he collected what he was owed and paid what he owed and kept his word once given. That code had kept him alive and had also kept him entirely, profoundly alone. He had not, in 15 years, found anything that made him want to stop doing what he was doing and be something else. He had not found anything that made the life feel wrong from the inside, even when he could see from the outside exactly how wrong it looked. He had ridden through 100 towns and watched families and couples and ordinary lives with the detached interest of a man watching a foreign country from a ship, aware of its existence, unsure it had anything to do with him. He was sitting in the saloon staring at a whiskey glass and thinking about the fraction of an inch that Julia Shelton had straightened her spine, and he was aware that something had shifted in the interior architecture of Phineas Rourke, and he had absolutely no framework for what to do about it. The stage departed at 3 o'clock. He went and watched it leave. He told himself he was not watching for any specific reason. He watched the stage roll out of Dusty Creek heading northwest, trailing a plume of dust, and he stood in the street until it was gone, and then he stood there a moment longer, which was unusual. Phineas Rourke was not a man who stood still once movement had already started. He had no money. He had a horse, a bay gelding named Absalom who was stabled behind the saloon. He had his revolvers and his rifle and a bedroll and a half-empty bag of dried beans. His next contract was supposed to come through an intermediary in the town of Cimarron, another day and a half's ride northeast, and would presumably pay him enough to resupply and keep moving. That was the plan. He saddled Absalom instead of going northeast towards Cimarron. He went northwest. He told himself he was not following the stage. He told himself the Santa Fe road was simply the better route because the water sources were more reliable on that side of the range. He told himself a variety of things, all of which were technically not lies, and none of which were entirely the truth, and he rode at an easy pace that kept him about 3 miles behind the stage cloud and did not close the distance. The stage made its first stop for fresh horses at a relay station called Arroyo Crossing, 30 miles from Dusty Creek. This was a standard Butterfield stage route stop, staffed by a hostler and his assistant, with a small corral of relay horses and a stone building that served as waiting area and supply depot. Passengers typically had 20 minutes to stretch their legs and drink from the water barrel while horses were changed. Phineas arrived at Arroyo Crossing about 40 minutes after the stage had departed it, which meant he was riding into a quiet relay station with only the hostler and his assistant present. He watered Absalom. He bought a meal of beans and salt pork with credit against the Cimarron contract, which the hostler honored because everyone along the Santa Fe road knew Rourke's credit was good. He ate standing up and asked, because he could not stop himself, whether the stage passengers had all looked well. The hostler gave him an interesting look. "All well enough," the hostler said. "One woman traveling alone asked me if there were any telegraph offices between here and Santa Fe." Phineas nodded once. He drank his coffee. He rode out. The stage reached the town of Mesilla Junction, 60 miles from Dusty Creek, late that same evening. It would stop overnight there because the Butterfield line did not run the mountain passes after dark. Julia disembarked at the Mesilla Junction Hotel, which was a 2-story adobe building with clean rooms and a dining room that served a fixed supper of whatever the cook had made, which that night was stewed beef and cornbread. She was eating alone at a small table in the corner of the dining room, thinking about how to word the telegram she intended to send Marguerite from the telegraph office she had located 3 doors down on the main street, when the dining room door opened and Phineas Rourke walked in. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped eating when she saw him. For a moment neither of them moved. Then she set down her fork because she had been raised with manners and said, "Mr. Rourke." He crossed the room without the hesitance of a man who was uncertain of his welcome, because he did not do hesitance, but with the particular deliberate quality of a man who has made a decision and is seeing it through to its logical conclusion. "Miss," he said. Then, realizing he did not know whether she used that title, he amended it carefully. "Mrs. Shelton." She looked at him steadily. "How do you know my name? Clerk at the Dusty Creek Depot. Hiram Potts. Writes names on the tickets." She considered that. It was reasonable and he clearly was not lying. "You read my ticket. I paid for it." "That you did," she said, and something in her tone shifted a fraction. warming slightly at the honesty of it. "Are you following me, Mr. Rourke?" He sat down at the table across from her without being invited, which she noted with interest was not the arrogant performance of masculine entitlement that she had grown so familiar with. It was simply a man sitting down because the conversation clearly called for proximity, and he was being direct about that. "I am on the Santa Fe Road," he said. "Same as you. And your reasons for being on the Santa Fe Road." He was quiet for a moment. In anyone else she would have called it evasive. In him it read differently, as though he were simply giving the question the actual consideration it deserved rather than answering it automatically. "Not settled yet," he said finally. Julia picked up her fork again. "That is an unusually honest answer. I find honesty reduces complications. For a man in your profession," she said, not unkindly, "that must present certain contradictions." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. More like the suggestion of a smile, seen from a distance. "More than I can count, Mrs. Shelton." She told him, because she had also decided that honesty reduced complications, and because 7 years of living with secrets had given her a violent distaste for them, that she was traveling to Santa Fe to her sister's house, that she had left her husband, that she did not intend to return, that the coin he had given her had made the difference between staying in Dusty Creek long enough for Gerald Shelton to potentially find her and being on this road tonight. She said all of this in the direct, level voice that was her natural way of speaking when she was not afraid, and Phineas Rourke listened to all of it without interrupting, which was the single most respectful thing any man had done for her in 7 years. "You don't need to explain yourself to me," he said when she finished. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." They ate supper together, which nobody in the dining room quite knew what to make of, and then she said she was going to the telegraph office before it closed, and he said he would walk her there, not as a suggestion, simply as a statement, and she accepted it in the same spirit. The night air in Mesilla Junction in August was warm and dusty, and smelled of the dry arroyos and the distant pine of the Organ Mountains to the east. They walked side by side with the particular careful distance of two people who are deeply aware of each other's proximity without acknowledging it. She sent her telegram to Marguerite. He waited outside. On the walk back she asked him how a man came to be what he was, and he told her the short version, which took about 4 minutes. She did not exclaim over it or moralize it. She said, "I think most men become what circumstance offers them when they are young and do not yet know how to refuse." He stopped walking for a moment. She turned and looked at him. In the lamplight from the street his face was all angles and shadow, and she could see in it the history he had just described, which was a history of loneliness so long-standing it had become structural. "That is either an absolution or a very precise accusation," he said. "Neither," she said. "It is just a thing I have noticed about people." They walked back to the hotel. She went upstairs to her room. He took a table in the hotel lobby and sat there until the building was quiet, which was a habit so old he no longer thought about it consciously. He was listening to the town settle into its nighttime version of itself, all the small sounds and creaks, and the distant bark of a dog and the wind moving through the mesquite along the road. He was thinking about what she had said, that most men become what circumstance offers them when they are young and do not yet know how to refuse. He was thinking about whether, at 32, it was too late to learn how to refuse differently. The next morning she found him already at the corral when she came down, talking to the relay hostler about Absalom's left rear shoe, which had loosened on the road. He had clearly been awake some hours already. She had a carpetbag that the hotel proprietor's wife had provided at no charge, because she had offered to mend a pile of linen in the early morning hours before breakfast, and in the bag she had packed a few necessities the proprietor's wife had added as well, a woman who apparently recognized the particular situation Julia was in and responded to it with practical kindness. The stage departed at 7 in the morning. Phineas rode alongside it. Not beside the windows in any conspicuous or sentimental way. He rode a quarter-mile ahead, out of habit, The way a man rides who has been on dangerous roads long enough that riding point is simply automatic. But she could see him from the stage window, the bay horse and the straight back, and she found that the sight settled something in her that had been unsettled for 3 days, which she noted with a certain wariness because she was fresh out of a dependency she was still bleeding from, and she was not interested in trading one dependency for another. What she was seeing, she told herself carefully and rationally, was simply a man being decent. People did not become untrustworthy simply because they were decent. The fact that she had become conditioned to distrust decency was Gerald Shelton's legacy to her, and she was not going to let Gerald Shelton determine her responses to the rest of the world from across 200 miles. The Santa Fe Road, on its second day of travel, moved into higher country. The flat desert scrub gave way to grassland, and then to the pine-juniper hills that rolled toward the great mountain ranges of the territory. The air changed, cooling slightly, carrying the smell of rain somewhere to the northwest where dark clouds were building over the peaks. The stage driver's name was Darnell Webb, and he had been driving this route for 4 years and knew every rock and rut of it, which was fortunate because in the early afternoon the road narrowed through a canyon section, and a section of it had been partially washed out by a flash flood 2 days prior. Darnell pulled the stage to a stop at the edge of the washout and climbed down to assess it. Phineas had already stopped Absalom and was studying the road ahead. Julia climbed out of the stage because she was the only passenger and because the canyon walls and the damaged road and the weather building overhead all felt like they needed to be witnessed with her own eyes rather than through a window. "How bad?" she asked, coming up beside Phineas, who was crouched at the edge of the washout with his hat off, studying the depth of it. "Passable," he said. "Needs the driver to take the left margin, there's solid rock under that lip, but he'll need to angle the team precisely." Darnell, who had come to the same conclusion independently, nodded in professional agreement. "It can be done. I've done worse." "What can I do?" Julia asked. Both men looked at her with the reflexive male surprise of 1878 at a woman offering practical assistance in a road emergency. And then Phineas, recovering from the reflex a full 2 seconds before Darnell, said, "Walk ahead. Stand at the far end of that solid section and let him know when the rear wheels clear it. He can't see that far back." "Done," she said. She walked ahead through the canyon, her heels picking their way along the rock lip, and stood at the far end of the solid section with her hand up. Darnell brought the team through with the skill of a man who had been doing this since before she was born, easing the heavy stage along the rock margin with a precision that was genuinely impressive. And when the rear wheels cleared the damaged section, she dropped her hand and Darnell let out a long breath, and Phineas, who had been walking beside the team's heads to steady them, looked up and caught her eye from 20 yards away. He was not smiling exactly, but something in his face was different from the controlled stillness of the day before. She did not name it. She simply felt it, like the first warmth of sun after a long, cold shadow. They made camp that night at a spring called Ojo Calian, which was marked on the stage route maps as a rest point in case of delays, because the storm that had been building all afternoon broke in the late evening and made the road ahead impassable until morning. Darnell had a canvas that stretched from the stage to a stand of pine, and under this improvised shelter, he made a fire and coffee, and produced from the stage's supply box a quantity of hardtack and dried jerky. The 4 of them, Julia, Phineas, Darnell, and the stage's assistant driver, a young man named Tom Pryor who was 17 and trying very hard to look older, sat around the fire while the rain hammered the canvas overhead, and the lightning moved through the mountains, and the firelight made everything amber and close. Tom Pryor kept looking at Phineas with the particular expression of a young man who has decided that a famous gunslinger is the most important person he has ever met and cannot figure out how to say so. Phineas was aware of this and maintained the steady, patient expression of a man who is thoroughly accustomed to it and finds it neither flattering nor interesting. Julia watched this and found herself thinking about what it cost a person to be looked at that way constantly, to be known in advance of yourself by a story that was only partly true, to never walk into a room as simply a person before becoming a reputation. "It must be exhausting," she said quietly to him, while Darnell and Tom were arguing companionably about the best route over the next day's mountain section. Phineas looked at her. "What must be?" "Being looked at the way that boy looks at you." He was quiet for a moment, and she saw something move through his face, a genuine surprise, quickly controlled, that she had named a thing he had apparently never heard named before. "I don't think about it," he said. "That's what makes it exhausting," she said. "The things you survive by not thinking about accumulate." The fire cracked and the rain pounded the canvas, and somewhere in the dark mountains an owl was calling. "Mrs. Shelton," he said, in a tone she had not heard from him before, something careful and deliberate in it. "How long were you married?" 7 years. "Was there anything good about it at the beginning?" She thought about this honestly. At the beginning he was attentive. "I mistook control for attention because I had no framework to distinguish them." She paused. "By the time I had the framework, the cost of the lesson was already paid." He was looking at the fire. "I have never been married," he said. "I have never been," he paused, and the pause contained something she could not entirely read. "I have never had anything that required me to stay in one place." "Has anything ever made you want to?" she asked, and then immediately said, "You do not have to answer that." "No," he said. And then, after a long enough pause that she had already moved on in her thoughts, he said, "Not until recently." She looked at him. He was still looking at the fire, and the firelight made his face something entirely different from the controlled, closed thing she had seen at the Dusty Creek stage depot. It made it human and tired and honest in a way that was, she realized, probably very rarely seen by anyone. She did not respond to what he had said, because it was the kind of thing that did not need a response so much as it needed to be allowed to exist in the air between them without being rushed or crowded. She had learned, in 7 years of a marriage that never allowed any silence to simply be, that silence could be one of the finest things two people could share. They sat by the fire for another hour while the storm worked itself out, and Tom Pryor fell asleep against the stage wheel, and Darnell dozed with his hat over his face. At some point, Julia fell asleep too, sitting upright against the stage wheel on her side of the fire. When she woke in the deep of the night, the fire had burned to coals, and she was covered with a bedroll that was not hers. She looked across the dying fire, and Phineas was sitting exactly as he had been, awake, watching the dark edges of the camp, and she understood that he had covered her and had been keeping watch, and that this was something he did not want acknowledged, would not know what to do with acknowledgement of, and so she did not acknowledge it. She pulled the bedroll around her shoulders and went back to sleep. In the morning the road was clear. They reached the outskirts of Santa Fe in the late afternoon of the 3rd day. The territorial capital was visible from miles out, the adobe buildings golden in the afternoon light, the towers of the palace of the governors catching the sun, the Santa Fe Trail running in from the northeast with its eternal commerce and dust. The stage came in along the Camino Real, the old road that had carried trade and life through this country for centuries before the American arrival, and pulled up at the Butterfield Depot on the south end of the plaza. Julia stepped down from the stage with her carpetbag and stood in the plaza and breathed the higher altitude air of Santa Fe, which was cleaner and cooler than the desert below, and thought that she had made it. She turned to find Phineas standing beside Absalom a few yards away. He was looking at her with the expression that she had been cataloging over 3 days and could still not entirely name, except that she knew now it was specific to her and had nothing to do with the reputation or the profession or the history. It was simply Phineas Rourke looking at Julia Shelton. "I will find my sister's house," she said, "and I will get you the money." "I don't want it back," he said. "Mr. Rourke, it was given freely," he said. "I would take it as an insult if you insisted." She looked at him steadily. "Then I owe you a debt I cannot repay in money." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "That is also not how I see it," she said. She paused and then said something that she had been thinking since the night of the campfire and the borrowed bedroll. "I am staying with my sister and her husband, Judge Wallace Hart. They have a large house and Marguerite is kind. If you have no pressing business taking you out of Santa Fe immediately, I would like very much if you would stay for supper." He looked at her for a long moment. "I have," he said, "a contract in Simmer and I have not responded to." "That is not what I asked." Another long moment. The plaza noise moved around them, the freight wagons and the voices and the military horses and the street vendors and the ordinary wild tumble of a territorial capital going about its business. "Yes," he said, "I will stay for supper." Marguerite Hart was a woman of 31 with Julia's same dark hair and a good deal more surface ease about her. The ease of a woman who had married a fair-minded man and lived in a house with a garden, and had been allowed, in short, to simply be herself. When Julia walked through her door, she cried immediately and entirely without embarrassment, and held Julia for a long time, and Julia held her back, and neither of them said anything about the bruise because it was the kind of thing that both of them understood without needing to make it into a formal acknowledgement. Wallace Hart was a man of 50, with a judge's bearing and a private warmth that he reserved for his household. When he shook Phineas Rourke's hand in the front hallway, he knew the name, and held the handshake a beat longer than necessary, which was his way of making it clear that in this house names and reputations were not the only currency. Supper was the finest meal Julia had eaten in years, not because of what it was, which was roasted chicken and summer squash and cornbread and dried apple pie, but because of the atmosphere of it, which was honest and warm and loud with conversation, and entirely free of the particular watchful silence that Julia Shelton had made of every meal in 7 years. Phineas was quiet through most of it, but not uncomfortably so. He answered Wallace Hart's questions about the territory with the precise factual knowledge of a man who had ridden nearly all of it, and he listened to Marguerite with the same complete attention he had given Julia at the Mesilla Junction supper table, and he ate everything on his plate, which Marguerite noted with approval. After supper, Wallace pulled Phineas onto the back portal for a cigar and a conversation that neither of them told Julia the substance of. Julia helped Marguerite wash the dishes and told her sister the whole story, start to finish, and Marguerite listened and asked sharp, good questions and said at the end, "This Phineas Rourke, what is he to you?" "I have known him 4 days," Julia said. "I noticed," Marguerite said, "that you said what he is to you rather than what he was. 3 days of past tense and already present tense." Julia dried a dish. "He is a decent man who made a generous gesture and rode the same road." "He rode the same road," Marguerite said, "the wrong direction from where he had business." Julia put the dish away. "I know," she said quietly. "And what do you feel?" She thought about the fire and the bedroll and the fraction of an inch her spine had straightened that first day in Dusty Creek, and the way he had listened without speaking, and the way he had looked at her in the Santa Fe Plaza. "I feel that I need to be very careful," she said, "because I am just out of something that damaged me in ways I have not fully assessed yet, and because he is a man whose life is exactly the kind of life that does not accommodate what I would need." "What do you need?" Marguerite asked. Julia folded the drying cloth. "Something permanent," she said. "Something honest, a garden, a life that is mine." Marguerite set the last dish on the shelf. "Then perhaps," she said, "the question is what he needs." On the back portal, Wallace Hart was asking Phineas Rourke something along very similar lines, in the oblique way of men of that era who discussed emotional matters only sideways. "You're not here for the work," Wallace said, lighting his cigar. It was not a question. Phineas let the smoke from his own cigar move in the warm night air and said nothing for a moment. The back portal overlooked a garden that Marguerite kept, full of hollyhocks and kitchen herbs and a small apple tree that had no business growing at this altitude but was doing it anyway out of apparent stubbornness. "No," he said. "She has been through a significant ordeal," Wallace said. "And she is intelligent and strong and capable of taking care of herself. She does not need saving." "I know that," Phineas said. "What she might choose to accept," Wallace said carefully, "is a partner who understands that those qualities are not inconveniences." Phineas looked at the apple tree. "I am not a partner," he said. "I am a gun for hire. I have been one since I was 17 years old." "That," Wallace said, drawing on his cigar, "is what you have been doing. It is not necessarily what you are." Phineas was quiet for a long time. "She said something like that," he said finally. "She generally does," Wallace said. "She said something like that to me the first time I met her, and she was 19 years old. It is one of her particular gifts." Inside the house they could hear Julia and Marguerite talking and laughing, the sound of women in a kitchen who are comfortable with each other, and the sound of it moved through the warm Santa Fe night and the smell of hollyhocks, and somewhere down the street a guitar was playing something slow and Spanish. Phineas stayed in Santa Fe. He did not announce this decision or explain it. He simply did not leave. He sent a message through the postal service to his Cimarron contact, declining that particular contract, which was the first contract he had ever declined without a pressing reason that anyone observing him could identify. He found lodgings at a boarding house on the east side of the plaza run by a widow named Senora Reyes, who charged fair rates and made excellent tortillas, and asked no questions about what her boarders did for a living, which was a policy that Phineas appreciated profoundly. He called at the Hart House the next afternoon, and the one after that. By the end of the first week, this had become a pattern that everyone in the household had organized themselves around without anyone formally declaring that they were doing so. Julia was staying in Marguerite's spare bedroom and had begun to make herself useful in the ways that her nature demanded, because Julia Shelton was not a woman who could sit still in someone else's house without contributing to it. She had found the garden, which Marguerite had planted but struggled to maintain with all her other household responsibilities, and had taken it over with a thoroughness that was slightly startling in its intensity. Phineas found her there on the fourth afternoon, on her knees between rows of late summer squash, entirely absorbed in the work. He stood at the garden gate for a moment watching her before she became aware of him. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. She had a streak of dark soil along her forearm and her hair was coming loose from its pins, and she looked, he thought, like a person who was in exactly the right place, which was something he had not often seen in his life, people being in the exactly right place. "I thought you had gone," she said. "Not yet," he said. She studied him. She had been thinking about him with the same honest, analytical attention she gave everything, pulling it apart and examining it. She had thought about the hidden motive question because she was not naive enough to think there was no such thing, and she had looked at his behavior carefully for any sign of the pattern she had learned in 7 years to recognize. She had not found them. What she found instead was a consistency that was plain and simple, and once recognized, almost painful in its rarity. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "what are you doing in Santa Fe?" He came through the gate and crouched down to her level, which was such a natural, unself-conscious gesture that it took her slightly aback. He looked at the squash plants. "There is something I want to say, and I am not accustomed to saying things like it," he said, "so I am going to say it plainly and accept whatever response you give." "All right," she said, and she meant it. He looked at her directly. "I don't know what I am going to do with what is left of my life. I have spent a long time not asking that question because the answer seemed obvious and I had not been given any reason to think it could be different. In the past week that has changed." He paused. "The reason it has changed is you. I am not asking you for anything. I am telling you the truth because you deserve to know it, and because I think you of all people have earned the right to only have truth spoken to you." Julia looked at him for a long moment. She felt something move in her chest that she recognized but had not felt in such a clean, uncomplicated form before. "That," she said, "is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me." "I mean it entirely," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what makes it the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me." She reached over and took his hand in both of hers, soil and all, and held it for a moment. His hand was large and roughened and very still under hers, the way the rest of him went still when something mattered. "I need time," she said, "not because I do not feel what you are feeling, because I am just out of something that I need to fully walk away from before I walk toward anything else. I owe that to myself." "I understand that," he said immediately. "I need to send for a lawyer," she said. "I need to find out whether there is a path to a legal separation or divorce in this territory. I need to know that my sister and Wallace are safe, that Gerald Shelton does not come here looking for me and cause them problems. I need to know that I can stand on my own feet financially before I stand on them toward anyone else." "All of that is reasonable," he said. "It might take time," she said. "I have time," he said, and it was the simplest thing he had ever said, and it was the most true. He released her hand. He stood up and looked at the garden. "The squash want thinning on the east end," he said. She looked at the east end of the squash row. He was right. She laughed, which surprised her, a clean, surprised laugh. And he looked down at her with that thing in his face that was not quite a smile, and was entirely better for not being one. The following weeks in Santa Fe were the kind that shaped things permanently. Phineas Rourke, who had never done anything resembling ordinary life, found himself doing a great deal of it. Wallace Hart, who was a practical and humane man, had offered him employment that was both legitimate and well-suited to his specific skills. The New Mexico Territory in 1878 was in a period of significant legal and civil disorder, what historians would later describe as one of the most violent eras in the territory's history, coinciding with the Lincoln County War that had been simmering since the year before. Wallace, as a territorial judge, had a genuine and pressing need for a man with Phineas's abilities, who could be trusted to operate within the law rather than around it. He offered him a position as a deputy territorial marshal, assigned to Santa Fe District, which was a formal appointment that came with a badge and a salary, and the implicit requirement that the 2 Colt revolvers be used only when legally necessary. Phineas had looked at the badge for a long moment. "This is not something I expected to be doing at 32, he said. "Most people don't do what they expected at 32, Wallace said pleasantly. Phineas accepted. The badge did not change him in any way that was obvious. He was still the same controlled, watchful, precise man. But there was something in having the badge, some shift in the orientation of the skill he had always possessed, that felt, he thought, like the difference between a knife being thrown at something and a knife cutting purposefully toward something useful. He was good at the work, better than good. He was extraordinary at it, because 15 years of reading rooms and situations and people for survival translated directly into the ability to de-escalate confrontations before they became violent, which was something the territory desperately needed, and to find the situations that genuinely required force and handle them with minimal harm. Julia watched this transformation without calling it one, because she knew he would resist that characterization. What she saw was not a man changing, but a man finding the shape he had always had, under all the layers of circumstance and survival. She was finding her own shape too. With Marguerite's help and Wallace's legal connections, she had engaged an attorney named Rufus Alderman, who specialized in the increasingly common matter of women seeking legal separations from abusive or abandoning husbands. New Mexico Territory in 1878 had more progressive divorce laws than most of the surrounding states, primarily because the Spanish and Mexican legal traditions that underlay territorial law had historically given women somewhat more legal standing than the Anglo-American traditions that were overlaying them. It was not simple, and it was not fast, but it was possible. She also found work. She was educated, which in 1878 was not universal, and she had a precise, clear handwriting and a facility with figures that Gerald had always used for his own business records and never acknowledged. She offered her services as a copyist and bookkeeper to the territorial government offices on the plaza, and within 2 weeks had more work than she could comfortably handle, and was being paid a fair rate for it. She rented a small room of her own, over a millinery shop on San Francisco Street, because she loved Marguerite entirely and needed to be in her own space. The room had a window that looked south toward the mountains, and she put the envelope of seeds on the windowsill. On a Saturday morning in late September, Phineas appeared at her door and asked if she wanted to ride out of town. He had arranged 2 horses and a saddlebag with food, and she had the sense that this had required some planning, and that planning was not the most natural thing in his emotional repertoire, which made it more significant rather than less. They rode out into the high desert south of Santa Fe, into the foothills where the chamasa was in full gold bloom, and the air smelled of juniper and pine, and the specific sweetness that dry country gets after a recent rain. They rode without talking much because they had both discovered that silence together was easy and good, and neither of them needed to fill it. They stopped at the top of a long ridge where the entire Rio Grande Valley spread out below them, the river a silver thread through the amber and ochre of the high desert, the mountains rising blue-gray to every horizon. Phineas unpacked the saddlebag. He had cold chicken and 2 apples, and a canteen of coffee that was still warm, and a piece of Senora Reyes's cornbread wrapped in a cloth. They sat on a flat rock and ate and looked at the valley, and the afternoon light moved across the mountains the way it does in high desert country, which is unlike any other light in the world, coming in horizontal and golden and making everything briefly more itself. "Tell me about Missouri," she said. Before, he ate a piece of chicken and thought about it. "My mother had a kitchen garden," he said, "similar to Marguerite's. She kept marigolds along the front because she said they kept the beetles off the tomatoes." He paused. "I don't know if that works." "It does," Julia said. "It's companion planting. It genuinely works." He looked at her. "You know about that." "I spent 7 years wanting a garden and reading about gardens because it was the only thing Gerald couldn't take from me," she said. "The knowledge of it. I know about nearly everything that grows." He was quiet. He was thinking about the envelope of seeds on her windowsill and the garden in Marguerite's yard and the fierceness with which she attacked the squash rows, and he was rearranging what he knew of her history around this detail. "She grew tomatoes," he continued, "and sweet corn, and pole beans up a stick fence." He paused again. "After my father left, she kept the garden for 2 more years. It was the last thing she let go of." She touched his arm, just that. She did not say anything. "I never went back," he said. "After I left, I meant to." He stopped. "That is the thing about intentions when you are 17. You have them, and then you are 20, and then you are 25, and then you are 30, and the intention is still there and the going back is not. Do you know where she is?" "She died in 1872, he said. "My brother Eli sent a letter to a contact in Abilene who knew to pass things along to me. I was in Colorado when I got it. 3 months after the fact." She slid her hand from his arm to his hand, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat on the flat rock in the gold afternoon light with their hands together, and the whole great valley spread below them, and the mountain air cool and clean around them, and it was the most uncomplicated thing either of them had felt in a very long time. He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. The space between them was very small, the way it had been moving toward very small for weeks, and it was entirely clear to both of them what that meant, and neither of them moved for a long charged moment that was somehow better for its patience. "Julia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "Yes," she said, and it was the simplest word, and it meant everything it possibly could. He kissed her there on the flat rock on the ridge with the Rio Grande Valley below them and the chamasa gold all around them, and it was not a tentative or uncertain kiss. It was a kiss that had 3 weeks of accumulated honesty behind it, and an entire complicated adult life on each side, and it tasted like all of that, real and serious and entirely present. When they broke apart, they looked at each other, and both of them were, for a moment, simply rendered speechless, which was unusual for Julia and essentially unprecedented for Phineas. "I need to tell you something," she said. "About my past, about Gerald, the full account, not the summary." "You don't owe me that," he said. "I want to give it," she said. "I need someone to know the full account. I need to say it out loud to someone who will hear it." "Then I will hear it," he said. She told him everything. The full 7 years. The specific mechanisms of control, the money, the isolation, the inspection of correspondence, the public face and the private reality, the accumulated small deprivations and the large ones, the last morning and the bruise and the decision. She told it all in the same clear, steady voice, and he listened to all of it without his expression changing in any way that suggested judgment of her, only the increasingly tight set of his jaw that she recognized, eventually, as controlled fury on her behalf. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Gerald Shelton is currently in Redemption, Texas," he said finally. She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I asked," he said. She understood then that in the weeks since Santa Fe, Phineas had made careful, quiet inquiries about Gerald Shelton's location and movements. Not in the way of a man planning violence. She could read him well enough now to know the difference, but in the way of a man who wanted to know where a threat was. "He will not find you," Phineas said. "And if he comes to Santa Fe, he will find that Judge Hart's territory is not a hospitable place for a man with his particular history." "Wallace said the same," she said. "Wallace and I had a conversation about it." She felt a complicated warmth at the image of those two very different men conspiring on her behalf. "You should have told me," she said. "You're right," he said immediately. "I should have. I defaulted to protection without consulting you, which is the wrong instinct." She looked at him with something that was close to astonishment, because the capacity to say that directly and without qualification was so far outside anything in her experience of men that she almost didn't know what to do with it. "Thank you for saying so," she said. "It won't happen again," he said. "I mean that. What concerns you is yours to know and to decide about." She touched his face. He went very still under her hand. "I know it won't," she said. They rode back to Santa Fe in the golden late afternoon, and the shadow of the mountains was long on the road ahead of them, and the town's lights were beginning to come up in the early dusk, and Phineas reached across between the horses and took her hand again and held it for the last mile of the road, which was something Darnell Webb would have described as the most improbable sight he had ever seen in 30 years on the Santa Fe road, if he had happened to be there to see it. He was not. But Senora Reyes was sitting on the portal of the boarding house when they rode in, and she saw them arrive with their hands linked and their horses closed together, and she went inside with an expression of profound private satisfaction and made a pot of excellent chocolate that she offered them both when they returned Phineas's horse to the corral. October came to Santa Fe and brought the first cold nights and the aspen turning gold on the mountain flanks. The divorce proceedings, as Julia's attorney Rufus Alderman had warned, were not swift, but they were progressing. Gerald Shelton, when formally served with the territorial legal notice through a Texas attorney, had initially contested it, which was both unsurprising and ultimately futile, because Wallace Hart's influence in the territorial legal system was significant, and Rufus Alderman was thorough to the point of relentlessness. What was surprising was that Gerald Shelton did not come to Santa Fe himself. What was surprising was the letter that arrived for Julia in the 3rd week of October. She brought it to Phineas unopened, which was itself a statement about what their relationship had become, a partnership in which significant things were shared by choice. He looked at the handwriting on the envelope. He did not touch the letter or suggest she open it or tell her what to do. He simply waited. She opened it. She read it twice, and her face went through several expressions, none of them simple. She set it down and looked at the middle distance for a moment. "He says he will not contest the divorce," she said finally. "He says he knows it is finished." She paused. "He says he is sorry." Another pause. "He says that he is aware, quote, that his behavior was unworthy and that he takes no pleasure in having caused suffering." Phineas was entirely still. "Do you believe him?" he asked. She thought about this with the honesty she gave everything. "I believe that he means it in the way a man means something when he realizes the cost of it," she said, "which is different from meaning it the way that would have mattered, which would have been before the cost became relevant." She folded the letter. "It does not change what happened, but it does make the legal proceeding simpler." "How do you feel about it?" she considered. "Tired," she said, "and grateful that it is almost over, and not much else." She looked at him. "I thought I might feel more. Anger or grief or something large, but mostly I just feel finished with it." He took her hand. "That sounds healthy." "I think it might be," she agreed. The divorce was finalized in December of 1878, which was unusually fast by the standards of territorial proceedings, and spoke to Rufus Alderman's skill and Wallace's quiet influence, and possibly also to Gerald Shelton's genuine desire to close the door. Julia Shelton, née Julia Marguerite Caldwell, stood in Wallace Hart's courthouse on a cold, bright December morning, and received the legal document that restored her full name and personhood under territorial law, and held it in both hands and felt the weight of it, which was light in paper and enormous in meaning. Phineas was waiting outside the courthouse on the steps in his good coat, the one he wore when things mattered, which had been seen in public perhaps 3 times in 6 months. He was standing with his hat in his hands and the cold December sun on his face, and he looked, she thought, genuinely nervous, which was the most human she had ever seen him look and also the most endearing. She came down the courthouse steps and stopped in front of him. "Well," she said. She was holding the document and smiling, which was not a complicated smile but a full one, reaching all the way up. "Well," he said. He was looking at her with the look she had been learning the language of since August, and she knew now what it said. She had known for some time. "I believe," she said, "that you have something to ask me." He was quiet for a moment. "I have something to say first," he said. She waited. "I know what I am," he said. "I know the history that I carry, and I know that it is not uncomplicated, and I know that you have just spent 7 years with a man whose history damaged you. So you have good reason to be very careful about the kind of man you let into your life next." He paused. "I am trying to be something better than what I was. I cannot promise that I will always succeed. I can promise that I will tell you the truth always about when I fail and why. I can promise that your voice in this life will be equal to mine. I can promise you a garden." She laughed at that, the same clean, surprised laugh from the squash rose. He went down on one knee on the courthouse steps in December of 1878, which was seen by several passers-by who stopped and stared with varying degrees of amazement, and said, "Julia Shelton, I am a man who did not know how to stay anywhere until I found someone worth staying for. Will you marry me?" She looked down at him. She thought about everything she had said she needed, the time, the ground under her own feet, the standing on her own before standing toward anyone else. She had done all of those things. She was standing on her own feet. She was financially independent. She was legally free. She was herself fully in a way she had not been since before she was 19 years old. She reached down and took his face in both her hands and said, "Yes, yes, Phineas, I will." They were married in March of 1879, in Marguerite's garden, which was a spectacular choice of timing because the early spring in Santa Fe was wildly unpredictable, and the morning of the wedding was cold enough to require every wool shawl in the Hart household, and a fire on the back portal, and a great deal of warm cider. Marguerite had decorated the garden with dried chamisa and juniper branches and early crocuses that had forced their way up through the cold soil, with the kind of stubborn optimism that Julia had always found encouraging in plants. Wallace performed the ceremony because he was a judge and because it seemed fitting. Senora Reyes came. Darnell Webb came, which required him to make a special trip from Mesilla Junction. But he had been genuinely invested in this outcome since a flat rock on a ridge south of Santa Fe, and he was not going to miss it. Tom Pryor came too, and had grown visibly in the intervening months, and was now driving his own stage runs, and had stopped looking at Phineas with the overwhelming admiration of a 17-year-old, and started looking at him with something more useful, which was the respectful attention of a young man who is trying to learn what a decent man looks like in practice. Several of Phineas's colleagues from the Territorial Marshal Service came, which was a group of men who were not, as a category, particularly accustomed to wedding attendance, but who showed up in clean shirts and held their hats and were visibly moved in the manner of people who have a reputation to maintain and are quietly not maintaining it. Rufus Alderman attended and brought a bottle of good Madeira wine, which he said was appropriate for legal victories. Julia wore a dress that Marguerite had helped her make, ivory cotton with blue embroidery at the collar and cuffs, because Julia had refused the standard white silk on the entirely reasonable grounds that it was March in New Mexico and she would freeze, and had chosen practicality, and the color blue that she had always been told was particularly well suited to her dark hair and her particular gray-brown eyes. When Wallace asked Phineas if he took this woman and Phineas said yes and looked at her, she saw in his face the thing she had seen first on a stage depot counter in August, the thing nobody had seen before and nobody had had a name for. She had a name for it now. It was love in the form of recognition. It was a man who had spent 32 years being completely unknown finally being known completely by one specific person, and the relief and joy of that, and the willingness to give that thing entirely back. She said her own yes in the same clear, steady voice that had always been her real voice, the one she had been reclaiming for 7 months, and when he kissed her the cold March garden and the watching faces, and the whole complicated, beautiful, difficult life they were about to build together felt entirely, absolutely possible. They stayed in Santa Fe. Phineas kept the deputy marshal position, which suited him and the territory alike, and over the following years developed into one of the most effective peace officers in the New Mexico Territory, not because he was faster or more frightening than anyone else, though both those things remained true, but because he had found a purpose that organized his considerable abilities towards something constructive. And because a life that mattered to him, outside the work, had made him more patient and more accurate in his judgment of when the work required force, and when it required something else entirely. They found a house on the east side of Santa Fe, a low adobe with thick walls and deep-set windows, and a yard that was overgrown and neglected, and which Julia looked at for exactly 30 seconds before determining everything she intended to do with it. The garden she planted that first spring was extraordinary. She planted the seeds from the envelope on the windowsill, which turned out to be a variety of climbing bean that her grandmother had grown in Virginia before the war, and they came up with the same stubborn persistence as the garden's first crocuses, reaching up through the high desert soil toward the New Mexico sun. Phineas built her a trellis for the beans out of cedar poles, which was the first thing he had ever built for domestic purposes, and which took him 2 attempts to get plumb, but which stood for years. In the fall of 1879, Julia discovered she was expecting a child. She told Phineas on a Sunday morning when they were sitting on the back portal with their coffee, and the early autumn light was warm, and the chamisa out beyond the garden wall was beginning to go gold. She said it simply and directly because that was still, and would always be, how she said things that mattered. He sat very still for a moment in the way he did when something significant landed. Then he set down his coffee cup and turned to look at her, and his face was open in a way she still occasionally caught her breath at, because the Phineas Rourke that Dusty Creek had seen in August of 1878 had not had a face capable of this kind of openness, and the fact that she had been present for the change was something she held with extraordinary care. "Are you well?" he asked. The first question always with him. Her well-being, her state, her reality. Always first. "I am very well," she said. He took her hand. He held it with the same profound stillness as always. "Good," he said, and then in a softer voice, "Good. Their son was born in April of 1880. They named him James Caldwell Rourke. James for no one in particular and Caldwell for Julia's maiden name, which she had kept professionally, and which she wanted carried forward. He was a loud, emphatic baby with dark hair like Julia's and gray eyes like his father's, and Phineas held him for the first time with the absolute stillness of a man trying very hard not to let his hands shake and not entirely succeeding. Julia watched him hold their son and thought about a coin pressed across a counter in August of 1878, and the fraction of an inch of a spine straightening, and the long, complicated road from that moment to this one. And she thought that the whole terrible, difficult journey of her life up to that point had been, without her knowing it, bringing her here. Not because suffering was necessary or meaningful in itself, because she did not believe that, but because every choice she had made, including the choice to leave redemption with nothing but her feet and her grandmother's thimble, had been a step on a road that led to a garden in Santa Fe, and a man who asked, always, about her well-being first. In the summer of 1881, Gerald Shelton died in Redemption, Texas, of a fever. Rufus Alderman sent a legal notice. Julia received it and sat with it for an afternoon and felt mostly a quiet sadness for a life that had been smaller than it needed to be, and then put it away and went out to the garden, where the beans were climbing the cedar trellis Phineas had built, and James, 14 months old and aggressively ambulatory, was systematically investigating the squash plants with the methodical intensity of someone who intends to understand exactly how things work. Phineas came home that evening to find them both in the garden, Julia on her knees in the bean rows and James sitting in the dirt at the end of the garden path, examining a beetle with profound concentration. He stopped at the garden gate in the gold evening light and looked at the two of them with the expression that his wife had named and knew entirely and loved completely. He came in through the gate and crouched down beside James and looked at the beetle. "A potato beetle," he said. "Marguerite will want to know about this." James looked up at him with gray eyes wide and said the word he had recently and triumphantly acquired, which was "duh," and held out the beetle. Julia looked up from the beans and found her husband taking a potato beetle from their son, with the focused gravity of a man receiving something of great value, and she laughed, and the sound of it went out over the garden and the adobe walls and into the wide Santa Fe evening. 2 years later, in the spring of 1883, their daughter was born. They named her Elara Reyes Rourke, Elara for no one and Reyes for Senora Reyes, who had become a grandmother to both children in every way that mattered and who wept when she heard the name in the particular way of a woman who had not expected to be remembered, and is therefore entirely overcome by being so. James, 3 years old and deeply opinionated about matters of household hierarchy, declared Elara interesting and proceeded to investigate her with the same methodical beetle examination intensity. Phineas watched his son approach his daughter with this expression and said to Julia, very quietly, that James was going to be exactly the older brother Elara needed, which was not an easy one. "He takes after his father," Julia said. "God help her," Phineas said, in a tone of genuine mock alarm, and Julia laughed, and he did the thing that was better than a smile. And Elara, 2 days old and entirely unimpressed with the world she had arrived in, slept through all of it with magnificent indifference. In 1884, Phineas was offered a promotion to territorial marshal of the entire Santa Fe district. He discussed it with Julia over 3 evenings before accepting, because discussing things with Julia over multiple evenings before deciding anything significant had become the architecture of how they operated, and she thought it was good and right and suited him, and said so, and he accepted. The promotion meant more travel and more responsibility, and occasionally the kind of danger that she had agreed to make peace with when she married a man whose profession was inherently dangerous, and she did make peace with it, most of the time. And on the occasions when she did not make perfect peace with it, she said so to his face, and he listened, and they talked about it and moved through it together, which was the whole essential difference between this life and the previous one. That there was nothing that could not be said and nothing that had to be navigated alone, He came home. He always came home. James grew into a boy who was quiet and precise and unexpectedly tender-hearted under the precision, who loved horses and mathematics and his sister with an intensity that he showed in practical, rather than demonstrative ways, building her toys and explaining the habits of beetles, and standing solidly beside her in any circumstance that required solidarity. Ilara grew into a girl who was loud and opinionated and curious about absolutely everything, who had her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark hair, and neither of their temperaments, but something else entirely, a joyful, combustible energy that the whole household orbited. In 1886, Julia's professional bookkeeping practice, which had grown significantly from its origins at the territorial offices, became a formal business in partnership with a woman named Adela Vasquez, who had trained as an accountant under the Spanish system and was the most rigorous person Julia had ever met professionally. They called the practice Shelton and Vasquez because Julia had kept her professional name and Adela had made it a condition, and the sign on the door of their office on the south side of the plaza was the source of a great deal of pride and some visible discomfort from the men who came through it for the first time and realized the caliber of what they were dealing with. In 1887, Julia planted the last section of the back garden with a variety of roses that a grower in Albuquerque had developed specifically for the high desert, deep red and intensely fragrant, and improbably hardy in the dry, thin soil. Phineas helped her plant them on a Saturday afternoon, both of them on their knees in the dirt with the children orbiting the garden in their various ways, James doing something methodical with a stick in the far corner, and Ilara narrating her own imaginary drama at high volume from the garden wall. They were planting the last rose bush when Phineas said, without looking up from the hole he was digging, "Julia," she said, "do you ever think about that day in Dusty Creek?" She sat back on her heels. "Often," she said. "Why?" He tamped the soil around the rose bush. "I have been trying to understand why I did it," he said. "For 9 years I have been trying to understand. The complete absence of logic in the action. I had nothing. I did not know you. There was no reason for it that I can describe." She looked at him. This man she had lived 9 years of the realest life she had ever known beside. This man who had kept every promise he had made on courthouse steps in March, and many he had never formally stated. This man who had learned to build trellises and attend weddings and receive beetles from toddlers with appropriate gravity, and fight hard for a territory's peace and come home and tell her the truth about all of it, every single day. "I think," she said, "that sometimes the most important things we do are the ones we cannot reason our way into or out of. We simply do them because something deeper than reason knows what is right." She paused. "You had nothing, and you gave it freely, to a stranger, because something in you recognized something that deserved to be helped." She reached over and covered his hand with hers. "I think you gave me your last coin because the person who was always going to be Phineas Rourke, the actual Phineas Rourke underneath every year of everything, was the kind of man who does something like that, and he was just waiting for the moment to prove it." He looked at her for a long moment. His gray eyes were exactly the same color they had been in the Dusty Creek stage depot 9 years ago, the color of winter sky. Everything else about the man had changed, opened, expanded, become more itself, but those eyes were the same, and she loved them for being the same. "You have the most useful mind of anyone I have ever known," he said. "I know," she said comfortably. "You may continue digging." He made a sound that was definitely a laugh, entirely disguised as something else, and turned back to the rose bush, and she sat in the afternoon dirt of the Santa Fe garden she had planted and grown and tended for 9 years, with the smell of the earth and the roses and the cedar of the bean trellis in the air, and the sound of her children inventing their particular worlds in the corners of the yard, and the warm, reliable presence of the man beside her. And she thought that the life available to a woman who insists on her own dignity and refuses to stop moving forward is precisely as good as this. It turned out that the fraction of an inch Julia Shelton had straightened her spine on a dusty New Mexico street had been one of the most consequential movements in the history of two individual lives, and that the man who had noticed it from across the street had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly that specific thing, that small, fierce refusal to be less than she was, to tell him what the other side of his own life looked like. And the coin. The last coin, pressed across the counter by a man who did not know why he was doing it except that it was right, had been the beginning of the most complete and honest life that either of them had been capable of imagining, which turned out to be better than either of them could have imagined, which was the specific and irreplaceable gift of building something with someone who is genuinely your equal. James Rourke grew up to be a surveyor who mapped significant portions of the New Mexico and Arizona territories, carrying both his father's precision and his mother's insistence on seeing things clearly and honestly. He married a woman named Clara at 24, having spent 5 years being absolutely certain of exactly who she was before asking, which was a characteristic entirely his own and also somewhat his father's. Elara Rourke grew up to be a doctor, one of the early women doctors in the New Mexico territory, trained in the East and returned to Santa Fe with her medical bag and her gray eyes and her loud opinions and her absolute refusal to be told what was and was not possible for a woman in 1905, a position that had been built, brick, by the life her mother had insisted on living. Phineas Rourke served as territorial marshal until New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, which he did not live to see by 3 years. He died in 1909 at 63, in his own bed, in the adobe house on the east side of Santa Fe, with Julia beside him and both his children and 4 grandchildren within reach, which was the exact opposite of the death available to a man on the road alone with 2 revolvers and no reason to stay anywhere, and he had been grateful for it every single day from March of 1879 forward. Julia Shelton Rourke lived until 1921. She was 68 years old. She sat in her garden in the last summer of her life, in the particular gold afternoon light of Santa Fe that she had loved for 40 years, and the roses that she and Phineas had planted together in 1887 were still growing, still stubborn, still fragrant, and the bean trellis had been rebuilt 3 times and was currently being tended by Elara's oldest daughter, who had her great-grandmother's dark hair and a way of giving her full attention to things that made everyone she talked to feel immediately and completely heard. Julia sat in the sun with her coffee and her hands quiet in her lap and thought about a stage depot and a coin and a man who had given everything he had to a stranger because something deeper than reason knew what was right. And she thought, as she had thought 10,000 times over 43 years, that the first honest thing in a life that goes on to be built entirely on honesty is worth everything it costs, and that it costs less than its absence. She closed her eyes in the warm afternoon. The garden was full of roses and beans, and the sounds of her granddaughter's voice and the high, thin air of Santa Fe, and it was exactly enough, and it had always been exactly enough. And she had known that since the moment on the courthouse steps in March of 1879, when a man had gone down on one knee and offered her his life, and she had said, in the clear, steady voice that was always going to be hers, yes. She smiled, and the sun was warm and the garden went on growing.